All right, great. Welcome in to those of you who are joining us live via Zoom. Thanks for um, logging on. Appreciate that. We recognize there'll be a few more people joining us shortly. But of course, we really value the time that we have with our guest today. So we're going to get started. This is a session that will be recorded. So if you have to leave midway through, or you have great content here that you want to share with a colleague, please refer them to this recording. We'll be posting it up on our YouTube channel either tomorrow or Monday. Officially, welcome. My name is Spencer Giese. I'm a research and education specialist at ACUI. I'm really pleased that you could join us for today's virtual roundtable. It's another in our installment of our Preparing for Fall series, and today we're talking about special considerations for faculty and student affairs partnerships. We've got an outstanding panel, which you will meet shortly, but I'll give you a very brief snippet there. We both have the co-authors of the Living Learning Communities at Work book, and we also have representatives from the Learning Community Collaborative, and they'll introduce themselves shortly. But before that, a few housekeeping items. Please continue to engage with our online community with the ACUI. We've got a number of threads there on a variety of topics as we prepare for whatever fall may look like as we're preparing for fall. We have our YouTube recordings on our YouTube channel. Those are a number of these virtual roundtables. We're over 60 virtual roundtables we've produced so far since March. So pretty outstanding number and great content out there for you to connect with and listen to on a walk, in your office, in the background, however you wish to absorb our content. And then, of course, we do have a COVID-19 resources page devoted to resources for campuses. As you're checking out your Zoom system, a couple notes. Today we are in a Zoom meeting format, which means you're able to be on webcam, you're able to use your microphone and engage with our speakers. That being said, for your best consumption of today's Zoom session, I would recommend using the speaker view Zoom setting. And that allows you to kind of be locked into whoever's presenting on whatever topic or content area that we're covering. Certainly, we also have the chat function as another place for you to be entering in information, data, questions, things like that to keep the conversation going. We really want you to engage with this session. It'd be helpful if we could engage with you via webcam and microphone, whether you're asking a question or you're just being a part of the process. And certainly, we've formed today's questions and topics from your registration information that you shared with us, but certainly if something comes up during the session, bring it up, put it in the chat, and we're happy to connect with you there. But without further ado, let's get into the content, and I'm going to pass it over to Jeff to help our panelists introduce themselves. So Jeff, take it away.
Hello, everyone. As Spencer said, welcome to today's session. My name is Jeff Godowski. I'm coming to you from Cornell University, where I serve as Assistant Dean in Flora Rose House. That's one of our residential colleges. I also work closely with ACUI on the Academic Initiatives Conference, which brings the world of living learning community programs, residential colleges, faculty and residents, and other ways that students, faculty, and staff engage in the residence halls. And then we have joining us today, as Spencer said, representatives from a learning community collaborative and co-authors from Living Learning Communities at Work. So if we like to go down the list and introduce ourselves, Karen, if you'd like to begin, and then we'll pass it along.
Sure, thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Inkelis. I am an associate professor in the higher education program in the Curry School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. I'm also the faculty principal of Hereford Residential College. In fact, I'm coming to you from the residential college as we speak.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jody Jessup Anger, and I'm an associate professor of higher education at Marquette University. I coordinate our student affairs and higher education program there.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mimi Benjamin. I'm an associate professor in the Student Affairs and Higher Education Department at Indiana University of Pennsylvania.
Hello, everyone. I'm Richie Gebauer. I am the Executive Director of the First Year Experience in Student Transitions at Cabrini University, and I also serve as a Faculty Director for our Impact, which is our Leadership Living and Learning Community, and I also am currently serving as the President of Learning Communities Association. Really excited to be with all of you today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Lundeen. I'm Director of Academic Residential Partnerships at Elon University, where I'm also in the philosophy department, and I work closely with our living and learning communities and our faculty who live in residence here.
Thank you again for our panelists joining us today. And as we begin thinking about what brought us here today, this idea of bridging the gap came up a lot, both in responses that folks shared and some preparation that we thought ahead of this. And really this idea of bridging the gap, we think about bridging that gap between academic affairs, faculty, and student affairs, specifically as we think about preparing for this fall, what partnerships in residence life will look like with residential learning communities or residential colleges, or how can we continue to increase collaboration on our campuses among faculty and staff members as we plan for a very different way of being in this fall semester. So I'd like to turn it over to our panelists who would like to share any thoughts about this idea. And then we'll also, as we go along, engage the audience for anyone else that would like to share reactions, comments, or ask questions for each of these topic areas.
I can start. So when I think about bridging the gap, this is one of my favorite notions to talk about with students in my classes. And I really like talking about it because students start to think about how different the worlds are of faculty and student affairs professionals. That faculty often work with an eye toward publication and dissemination of knowledge, and student affairs professionals often work toward student success and ensuring that students have a good college experience. But one place where they're really common is their love of students, right? That oftentimes faculty enjoy being with students, as do student affairs professionals, obviously. So when I think about bridging the gap, I always situate the student at the center and then think about what expertise faculty can bring to the conversation and what expertise student affairs professionals can bring to the situation, and then create pathways in order for both to do so. And so faculty certainly are bringing disciplinary expertise, and they're also bringing pedagogical expertise. And student affairs professionals are bringing expertise on student development and the ways that students engage outside of the classroom, and they're bringing their own pedagogical expertise as well. And so thinking about how these two entities can really start talking with one another, and usually centering students and the student experience broadly is a good way to start that conversation. And then certainly there are some ways to sustain it. And I'll stop there and let my colleagues talk about it as well.
Maybe I can add in more of a question than an answer to a question. And I'm thinking about Jody's comments in light of the work that Karen and Jody and Matt Wierzinski and I did in the Living Learning Communities that work the book along the lines of the best practices model. And at the very base of the best practices model is this question about figuring out goals and objectives. And for me right now, the question is, have the goals and objectives changed? When we think about living learning communities, when we think about residential programs in general, are the goals different now given the current situation, or are the goals the same? And if the goals are the same, how do we sort of unpack those goals so that we understand how there are different ways to reach those goals, as opposed to sort of turning to our tried and true methods that right now may not be available to us. And so that's something that I'm continuing to ask myself as I think about some of these programs. Things like, what what is a community and what does it mean to feel like you are part of community? What are the elements that are necessary for a person to feel like they're part of a community? And then trying to figure out, now what do those elements look like if students have to be 6 feet apart? What do those elements look like if people have to be on the screen? And while I don't have the answers to those questions, I think for me, starting to step back and ask those questions is an important kind of first step.
Sorry, Karen, did you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Richie.
I saw you take your mic off. I'll just really quickly follow up on Mimi's comment to talk a little bit about the best practices model. Again, that infrastructural level and that collaborative piece at the center of that level. I think that in this year where we all look at our goals and objectives, we're obviously all going into an academic year that is extremely unorthodox in comparison to all of our other experience preparing to start academic years. And so I think we have to give ourselves permission to simplify things in this current moment, that the things that we would achieve in a traditional academic year, we don't necessarily need to achieve in this moment where our students are learning online, are going to have a large restriction about how they can move about campus, how they can interact within our residence halls. I think that it's going to be, it may be too much. And again, that's why we have to look at our programming and our curriculum at our institutions, but recognizing that it's okay to pull back a little bit, to amplify the learning that our students are going to engage with, knowing that this transition to a very different academic year and a very different type of learning, both in the residence hall and outside of the residence hall, is going to be a huge transition for them. And so streamlining and potentially simplifying what we're doing in the ways that we're going to collaborate between faculty and staff on our campus and administrators on our campus is going to be something that we need to think through, and again, give ourselves permission to do that simplification. So I'll just kind of end there. I'll turn it over to Karen.
Yeah, I was just gonna say something very similar, that I don't know that it's, given everything else is going on, maybe this is not the year to tinker around and wholesale change your goals and objectives. Instead, this is the year to think about, how do I deliver those goals and objectives in a different way, particularly if that's your new reality at your campus. And I think this is a good segue to lead into the next question. But then how do we use non-traditional ways to engage with the academic affairs and faculty when clearly it's going to be difficult for them too? They're operating in a new reality as well. And so there are some places that we started talking before this even got started, this webinar, of some places you can consider that you may not have thought about before. One of them is a teaching and learning center. So if you are on a campus that has a Center for Teaching Excellence or a Center for Teaching and Learning or something like that, which are principally there to help faculty with their teaching, these are folks who generally get it, so to speak, and that they understand why it's important to be student-centered to begin with, to go back to something that Jody said. And they might be good partners to engage with when trying to come up with innovative programming, particularly from an academic perspective. I think another thing that I'm going to try to do myself as principal of Hereford is to constantly scan the other programming that's taking place at the university, and anything that fits with our goals and objectives, I'm going to reach out and say, hey, Department of Politics, I see that you're offering a lecture on blah, 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 on the presidential election on October. How would you like 200 students to join? Right? And I'm sure they're going to say yes, because they need people too, right? And under those circumstances, say, okay, let's partner up. And now that you know that you're going to get some students from our college, let me tell you a little bit about them and what you might expect from them and how you might want to engage with them in this talk. And then what we kind of hope is from that, 1,000 flowers bloom, right? And then they get a taste of what it's like to work with us, and they might become a permanent partner because they so enjoyed the process. So those are the kinds of things I think we should really try to capitalize on, things that are already there, that are right at our fingertips, that just might take a little bit of massaging to make happen, instead of trying to reinvent new partnerships from scratch during a time of crisis. Better to try to do with what you have, essentially. Thanks.
Can I add something there? Karen's comment about partnering with centers for teaching excellence. I think that one of the things that may be true, I'm guessing that a lot of campuses did this. Certainly our Center for Teaching Excellence reached out to faculty to ask, what did go well in the spring when you made the transition? What were some of the challenges? And finding out what some of the academic successes were, those might be things that you can utilize to create or to kind of address some of the things that you want to accomplish in the fall as well. And so if a faculty member found that, a particular approach, using technology really did keep students engaged, student affairs could really make use of that kind of information when it comes to programmatic elements or, any kind of initiatives that you're trying, at least finding out what seemed to go well, and particularly what went well at your campus will, I think, be really beneficial information to have.
I think it's also so similar to what you just said, Mimi. There may be some institutional data that you all can tap into that you may not have even been made aware of, where your institutions may have surveyed students and the student experience from March on, or from when most campuses went to fully remote instruction until the end of the term, to hear from students what were the big wins of that and what were some of the pitfalls of that, to get a sense both of inside the classroom and outside of the classroom, what worked best for building community, for building trust, et cetera, while being on virtual platforms. And I just want to go back to how Jody opened up the conversation by saying, how you're talking to your graduate students, what already bridges the gap, which is this focus and commitment to the student in every situation. And I think that right now, one of the first things we can do to go back to bridging that gap is to refocus the conversation, not on the student as a vector of potential infection or disease, but again, as a human being who deserves our attention in terms of both developing them socially, developing them professionally, developing them educationally, and regardless of whether that happens on a Zoom call or whether it happens in a classroom or whether it happens in an on-campus residence. And I think that right now that seems to be, at least that's what I'm hearing at my institution and other local institutions here, the cry for information, particularly from the academic affairs side or the faculty side, seems to be, but if I can control my classroom and how it is organized and socially distanced, what's to say that it's not going to be all chaos in their dorm rooms, right? Or in their fraternity parties, right? So they want to know how student affairs professionals are going to be managing the student, but but the tone of the conversation is often about to protect one's health or potential exposure, again, rather than being focused on the learning and overall development of the students. So I think that also has to be a first step, is just refocusing the conversations again on the students' development and learning.
Well, in fact, you can use that as a leverage point, because I've heard the same thing. Faculty are mostly afraid of students, right? And they're terrified about what happens to the students once they're released from the classroom and they go back to their residences. Well, you can tell the faculty, you can play a part in that, right? Your reach to the students doesn't only extend to the classroom. So if you want to be a part of our programming, the worst thing, idle hands are the biggest fear. So let's give them something to do, right? And you can help us with that by doing some programming with us. And maybe that would actually work under these circumstances. It's a different world now.
I want to echo that, Karen. I really agree with that. And I think that this notion, and I don't know if other universities are doing this, but at Marquette, we have these hybrid classes where a fraction of the students meet in person, and then they've got some online education as well. And so thinking about those ideas that Karen brought forth before of, are there lectures that are already happening on campus, or are there activities that are already happening virtually that we can encourage our students to attend? And because of this hybrid model, we actually have, some impetus for them to do so. Certainly this is a challenge and it's an unprecedented time, but it can also be an opportunity to think about, how we might engage in meaningful interactions across, some of these barriers that we have traditionally faced. I want to let folks know that I am active in the chat, and I would encourage you all to be, and I'm sure everybody else is too, but I'll encourage you all to feel free to ask questions in there, and we'll try to incorporate those into our discussion. Or if you have something that you want to say, certainly we can acknowledge you in the chat and then bring you into the discussion as well.
And just echoing what Jody just shared, if anyone would like to share some best practices from their institution, what's working well as you are thinking and planning for the fall and communicating across the academic affairs or across the student affairs, that might be helpful for other folks to hear in this group. We'll just pose that question out to the group for a little bit before we transition to the next topic. Okay. So if anyone has anything else to add, again, feel free to use the chat and we'll go back to you and incorporate your ideas again in the larger group. Next, we'll be thinking a little bit more specifically about what this means in building community, thinking about faculty engagement in our programs and what community building might look like for this fall semester.
I mentioned this before, but one of the things that I think would be worth doing is unpacking this idea about what it means to feel like you belong to a group. You know, you are part of a community. I also think it's worth thinking about for the reality of our fall semester, if you are part of a community that is an online community, what is it about that experience, again, that makes you feel like you are part of a community? And how can you replicate some of that through, whether it's residential learning communities or residential colleges, or, you know, the faculty involvement within residence halls? You know, what are some ways that you can mirror or take advantage of those elements that make you feel like you are part of something, in order to have that kind of connection for the fall in particular?
I've been thinking about this. Oh, sorry. It's always Richie.
No, you and I are we're on the same page. Yeah. We keep trying to jump in at the same time. Go
well,
ahead.
Last time I went first, so it's your turn to go first, Richie.
Oh, did I think it was the other way around, but okay. I was just going to say that I think we're, when I think about collaboration between faculty and student affairs staff, or you know, academic affairs and student affairs, I don't think we necessarily take a great deal of time to understand the professional norms that are associated with each individual area. And I know Jody kind of referenced this a little bit at the start today. And so I think in this moment, it is actually even probably the most pivotal time for us to do that. That the language that we're communicating to students in the classroom and in the residential space really is aligned, and that there's not mixed messaging here. So I think even going back to the first prompt today, you know, I think that in order for faculty to truly engage, I think that and for residence life to, you know, staff and student affairs staff to engage with faculty within the community, for them to really truly work together, I think they have to understand what each other brings to and contributes to the community as large. And that we're in a moment where sometimes as we're operating as silos, you have student learning outcomes that exist within the classroom, and then you have residential learning outcomes that exist within the residential space. And those two sets of learning outcomes don't necessarily align with one another. And so I think as educators, regardless of what side of you know, of the institution we're on, I think it's a moment where we have to understand each other's professional norms. We have to understand how these two different experiences, the classroom and the residential space, whether that's a face-to-face classroom, an online classroom, and the residential space, how the learning outcomes that we're seeking for students to achieve over the course of the semester and year, how are they different? And if they are different, how do we start to align them so that we're making the student experience more effective? Because we're in a moment, again, to go back to my original comment earlier, where I think we need to be simplifying things for the students. And to simplify things means that we have to ensure that they see how the classroom experience and how the residential experience truly are in sync with one another. And so I think it's a great opportunity for us to really begin to dialogue with our colleagues and to begin to understand our norms, so that from there we can build shared learning outcomes to support our students in the various spaces that they're going to be learning on our campus. And I think that this moment where, to go back to Shannon's comment earlier about kind of fearing the student and what they're going to be doing outside of the classroom, I think if residence life and student affairs and academic affairs staff can have a common language, we can establish an understanding from day one about what it means to be responsible within our communities and the way that we're engaging with our classmates outside of the classroom, you know, that we're following the guidelines and the stipulations that are presented by our campuses. And if students are hearing that from various folks on campus, and the message is clear and consistent rather than stated in multiple ways that and sometimes end up becoming confusing, we may be more impactful in ensuring that they actually are following those guidelines. It's not going to be perfect, obviously, but I think the more unified the messaging is within our communities, the more effective we'll be.
So I was going to mention something about community building, but I realized I needed to back up to say that at the University of Virginia, since we're a large public university, even though we are inviting students to come back to, we call it grounds, it's pretentious, it's actually campus, it's a stupid word, but she's laughing. Nevertheless, it's pretty clear almost 85 to 90% of the classes are going to be online because we don't have the infrastructure to support large classes and appropriately social distance. So my guess is most of students' realities, especially those in the residential college, is still going to be largely online. And so with that in mind, I've been trying to think a lot about how do you build a community in a residential college, because that's critical. When most of our students will probably not be interacting with each other in person, even though they may be living right next to each other. And so I've been thinking a lot about trying to use technology to my advantage. And so I've been looking at a lot of online tools that work with things like Zoom or other LMS systems that I'm going to try to use. I'm going to share some of them today because I think a lot of you might like these as well. The first one is called Flipgrid. What that is it's a free technology, and all it is a portal to allow anybody to make a short video for like a minute or whatever, and then they become the little grids on the person's screen. So you know, you could have almost all of the students and even the faculty and the staff make a little bio about themselves or something like that. Oh, thank you, Richie. to put simultaneously on a page, and even though they may not be able to meet each other in person, they can meet each other on Flipgrid. Another possibility could be something like Padlet or VoiceThread. And why those are useful is because I'm trying to think of ways we can talk about what it means to be a part of a special community like a residential college, even though you may not be able to meet, right? And so you can build, they're essentially like presentations, but they're more interactive on VoiceThread, and everyone can contribute separately, but it becomes one giant presentation at the end. And I was thinking that'd be a really neat way for people to talk about, maybe through a testimonial style, what makes being a part of this community very special. And then what I was thinking actually is, in terms of getting faculty engaged, is in the process of using these technologies, we invite the faculty who work with us anyway, or perhaps new faculty, to try out Flipgrid, Padlet, and VoiceThread as a part of our community. And when they see how cool it is, it might occur to them, wait a second, I could use that in my teaching. Right? So it's a win-win. They're going to be interested in doing it because they can take that technology and make use of it in their own work. But at the same time, we'd be building a community together virtually, even though it's not the same as in person. It could be the very best next thing that we do. So I'll keep you, I'll let you know how it works. We're going to try that this fall because I don't think we don't have much of another choice, to be frank with you.
Going off of some things that were shared already, really thinking back to what are the goals of our living learning environments, and how do we think about that this year specifically? Something that we've been thinking about since in a residential college environment as well. The faculty-student interaction in sort of a non-traditional academic setting is one of our highest goals, and really building those relationships so that students develop relationships with someone that they might become a personal letter of reference, someone that can include them in an internship or in a lab or research opportunity, and the ways that we've seen those relationships grow over time. But how do we continue to do that in these spaces? So we've been thinking a lot about either using some sort of podcast format where we do sort of deep dive interviews with our house fellows, where they can share their personal life stories. You know, how did they get to be the person that they are today? And hearing, I think, specifically in times like these, stories of resilience that we all sort of bring to the table. and how that can be both a community building effort with our students, but also a way to encourage during really trying times that are unlike others that we've experienced before. And so that's one way that we've been thinking about continuing to bridge this gap, but build community across between faculty and our students, so that they can still find those relationships that they can hopefully foster over that time, and continue growing the culture that it means to be, you know, in our specific environment, a resident in a Flora Rose house. In a more residential college type of environment, the building of a culture over multiple years is something that's very important to us as students feel like that sense of belonging. And so really thinking about, like I said, the goal of the faculty-student relationship, but the sense of belonging piece for our students, so that they still feel connected to this space, even if they're physically not here, is something that's important to us for our returning students, who might not actually be able to join us in person this fall, and thinking through that.
One of the things that I've been thinking about in this conversation is how, if we're hybrid or if we're fully online, you know, or if we're in person but not often on campus, what does that do to the existing relationships that exist between student affairs and academic affairs? So, for example, I know that in Marquette's culture, there's very much a culture of doorway conversations, right? When I want to talk with someone, it's very common that I just walk down to their office, we have a conversation, and I move along with my day. And when we went virtual, obviously that wasn't a possibility anymore. And so thinking about how we might change our structures in order to facilitate those doorway conversations with each other across academic and student affairs, and also in our conversations with students. Is there something that that could parallel a doorway conversation? So do we have, you know, whereas it might not have been necessary before, do we have office hours where it's really easy for students to connect with us? Do we have office hours where faculty and folks in student affairs, you know, whether it be a residential college or living learning community or you know, just a residence hall, are there opportunities if we used to have relationships with those, across those entities and we don't now, are there opportunities for those structures to get back put into place? Because I think it's really important in building trust across academic and student affairs. There's research out there that says that one of the reasons that faculty and student affairs partnerships fail is because of a lack of trust. And I see it in my own learning community. That is my house. My partner is in student affairs and I'm a faculty member. And you know, when we start to feel a sense of fear, we sometimes lash out to the other, right? Well, you know, you faculty aren't working hard enough, or you're working on your, you know, academic initiatives and you're not focused on the student. Or I might say to him, well, you know, you're you're focused on the wrong things. And so it's a sense of, you know, but we live in the same house, and so obviously that trust is there already, and it's sort of assumed. But when we don't have those relationships, what is done in an academic or in a online or hybrid environment that can really serve to rebuild that?
I'm sure I'm not saying anything that is new information, but I do feel like part of the challenge right now is time. And it goes back to, you know, Richie made the comment about trying to simplify things, and I think it's a good idea. And Jody, your comments about building trust and how do we get back to some of those moments, I feel like part of what we're really battling against is this, not that it's new, we're always battling against this, but this element of time, and where do I fit in the time to learn the new technology? Where do I fit in the time to stop, take a step back and do some brainstorming, to, you know, unpack this idea of what community entails in order to figure out how to move forward? I feel like that is such a significant element of, and that might really in some ways speak to also this fear that Jody, you were referencing. You know, it's like we're afraid of kind of the, I don't know, the Pandora's box that's been opened, and you know, we sort of have to figure out and nobody has, I don't know that anybody has any great ideas, although if they do, they should share them, how we can manage that.
I'm just going to offer a couple of examples of things that happened in the spring here that were successful, and so and the things that we're planning for the fall. So one example in terms of keeping up faculty engagement in the residence halls and in our on-campus apartments, because as we've already discussed, many faculty who are planning to just come to class to teach their few face-to-face classes, if they have them, and otherwise work from home remotely, it's going to be that much more difficult to get them into campus. And especially if they have any dependents at home who are, whether it's a, somebody that they're caring for, whether it's a child or a parent or whatever, it's going to be even more challenging. But I think that, one example of things that have worked in the past that we're going to try to do this fall is, we know that meals always bring students together, but we also know that we're going to have to share food in a very different way this fall. And so one thing that we've done in the past is cooking demonstrations, where we've utilized one of our chefs in the dining halls and a faculty member who has an interest in whether it's food studies or in a particular history of a particular culture and a particular food item. And they'll come in and they'll do a lecture on the food, right? A lecture on the history of the food. The chef will prepare the food, teach the students, and then the students have a hand at, making one portion of the meal, and then they eat it together, right? Well, we're still going to try to do that via Zoom or WebEx. And so the faculty members, wherever they're comfortable, at home or wherever, and we don't care if they've got, their kids or partners or whatever are in the video, they're going to still give a mini lecture, like a 5-minute lecture about the history of whatever food it is that the students have elected to try to prepare. The chef is also going to be preparing food with a camera angle on the kitchen items, right? And we're going to allow the students who are living on campus to come pick up ingredient packs at the residential office or the neighborhood office in our case. And they'll have to sign up for it, and they sign up to use the shared kitchen. And then that group of students will be able to watch and interact with both the faculty member and the chef, and then cook their meal and eat it, so long as it's fewer than 10 people in their lounge, right? So that's something that we feel like we can make everybody quote unquote comfortable and still doing. And it won't require faculty to be on campus after hours. And we know that that's also been a deterrent for many faculty being engaged, particularly in our learning communities or even in our residential colleges, if they don't already live in. They say, I can't do anything after 5 because of childcare or because I need to go home for whatever reason. And now with the advent of technology and our very quick use of it, many of us are still on a steep learning curve. I think that this will allow faculty to still be engaged in a way that they feel comfortable. So I'll just leave it with that one specific example, but those are the kinds of things that we're trying to rethink so that we can maintain a level of faculty engagement that won't be the same as it was obviously pre-COVID, but where we still feel like they understand the impact that this is going to have on the students, and they can do it in a way where they feel their health is not being put at risk.
So thanks everyone for sharing this topic. We'll hop to the next topic, but please, again, feel free to use the chat function, share any best practice that you have, and we'll have more time for an open forum at the end of this talk before we close out today.
Jeff, can I really quickly just say, I'm putting a link in the chat box here that as the LCA as Learning Community Association has been having a variety of discussions virtually, we've been creating an interactive Google Doc that people can go in and add resources and strategies and community building opportunities to. So I'm just putting that in here, putting that link in there that folks can go to that and access those resources and some of the things that folks have talked about here on there. So I wanted to let you move on, but I just wanted to make sure I said that before I put the link in.
Thank you, Reggie. So our last topic that folks have mentioned as a hot button issue for this fall specifically is supporting student activism both in and out of the classroom, and then also what are safe ways that we can support that as students are engaging in protests or engaging in civic discourse, civic engagement on our campuses or in our classrooms. What will that look like specifically this fall?
So 2 ideas. One would be to use those video making tools that I talked about before. So instead of students feeling the need to have to protest in person, they can lodge their protest through the form of a video. And in fact, probably could reach a greater audience than any one in-person protest could. So that's one possibility. The other is, I think I'd really like to focus on voting as a way to channel some of this energy, particularly if you're going to be working with largely first-year students. This is their first election. They can probably vote in the presidential election. They may not even know how to register. So the first question is, how do you register locally? So any information you can give them to make it as easy as possible for them to learn how to register, or if they'd rather register a vote in their own locality, that's fine too. But what are the rules for absentee voting? As you know, every state has different rules, different deadlines, whatever. So as much aggregation as we can do to make it easier for them to vote, I think that would be a really useful project. And not just for us to tell them, but get the students involved, right? We can make a website with all the information on absentee voting. We can organize get out the vote virtual parties. These are things we can do that would get some of the people's emotions that rightly so have been an outgrowth of what's been happening this summer, but channeled towards a really important thing. And I'm hoping that would be something that would be meaningful for them as well.
Although I don't know anything about using VoiceThread, based on the way that you've described it, Karen, I could envision VoiceThread being a really good way to gather, you know, a lot of voices, for lack of a better word, that might support some of these kinds of initiatives too.
I think another idea that piggybacks off of Karen's is really thinking about how to utilize faculty and faculty assignments that can bridge the curricular, co-curricular. An example that I thought of that one of my colleagues did this summer is she is in a social media marketing class, and she had students create memes around social justice issues, and then they were free to share those memes with one another, and certainly had the capacity to share them out into the world as well. And so really thinking about how some of the assignments that students are engaging in around social justice topics can move outside the walls of the classroom and engage their peers and the rest of the world.
And I think it's going to be our responsibility, especially I'm primarily thinking about first-year students coming to our campuses and starting, initiating their experience in our living and learning communities. It's going to be our responsibility to open the dialogue about what's been happening, about the death of George Floyd and the events that have occurred after, and the activism that's been existing across cities in the U.S. I think that we have to open the door to that conversation, because we're going to have diverse cohorts of students that are living within our residential spaces or stepping into our classrooms that are going to have a voice on these topics and want to engage in that discussion. And so we could do that in idle classes that are not part of learning communities, but I think particularly for our students to live in community with one another and to appreciate the differences that exist among them, to talk about this and create open spaces for dialogue are going to be really, really critical. And then using that as an opportunity to show them that we support their activism in whatever way that might, whatever modality that might be. But I think that it's going to be our responsibility as educators to initiate that conversation, because I worry that how can we have community if those questions are lingering in students' minds, and yet they don't know necessarily how to initiate that conversation, especially as a first-year student who's trying to make friends and develop relationships in that first week, but yet are feeling a lot of questions or wondering what other people are thinking around these really important topics, and are also trying to build relationships with their peers. I think that creating spaces, not just one, but multitude of spaces, both in the residence hall and the classroom early on are really critical. And that we as residents, life staff, as faculty, as student affairs educators, that we have to be part of that conversation, so that we're also becoming members of these communities and partners with the students in their learning process, and not just administrators overseeing a community experience.
So something that we've been thinking a lot about is in the past, some of our ways students have engaged either in activism or civic engagement was through service learning opportunities. But knowing that this year, some of those opportunities might not be available to do in-person service learning. And so we've been thinking about, in partnership with our public service center and the work that they're doing with voter engagement this fall, and also our student health center, and thinking of different types of peer mentor roles that our students who had been in these service engagement programs can transition into this type of role for this fall. And so that might be, you know, instead of a weekly service requirement, learning about public health and how they can use different strategies of bystander intervention to engage other students they might see who are not engaging in healthy practices this fall. And then simultaneously work with our public service center and thinking then what are other opportunities either during meals or check-in and whenever possible to do in a safe way to engage people in conversations about voting this fall, how to do that remotely or by absentee in safe ways. And so rethinking again, like our service learning to be in these peer mentor roles where it's sort of a cross-pollination of bystander training, public health, and student activism in one. So we'll let folks know how that works out and thinking about that as a strategy for this fall.
I do think that the peer mentor idea, it reminds me that sometimes we have to remind ourselves we should ask students what their ideas are for how to do this, because our sort of one step away or maybe many steps away from our undergraduate experience might limit what we can come up with. And so inviting students to contribute to the ideas, I think, is a really critical step in this process.
So we'd like to open up again before doing any closing wrap up. Ideas that came out during today's session, comments, questions, best practices that you're doing at your institution that you'd like to share with the group, and really take this time to engage with us either in the chat or if you'd like to unmute yourself or use your video function. Now's the time that we'd love to hear from you.
I have a question I'd like to pose to the group. So I'm at California State University, Monterey Bay, and we are completely virtual for fall. It's looked like we're probably going to be completely virtual for spring, and we have a minimal student population on campus. With that shift, everyone, including student activities, recreation, advising, everything's online. So what we've been looking at, because the platforms that were presented are fantastic, but our concern is that with students having to log into so many different platforms, including we're testing the onboarding of Canvas and we're an iLearn campus. So our students are even going to be split between two different like learning management softwares. We're concerned that our students aren't going to participate just because they don't want to navigate so many platforms. Has anybody found any good way to centralize where everything is for your students so that as we're working on building these programs and getting the faculty and the academic offices engaged with our residential students, that they actually choose to participate?
So
That's a
Kyle,
great
that's a
question.
Oh, sorry.
I think we're saying the same thing. I think it's a great question, and I'm not sure anybody has a good answer for that.
Well, in fact, what I was going to say is what I found is the opposite works. We tried really hard to centralize all our materials in the spring, and nobody attended anything. But instead, what we found was more beneficial was asking the students to promote it on their GroupMe site. And when they did that, all of a sudden we got attendance. So students, what I found is, yeah, students say they're all zoomed out, but if they're incentivized, they'll go on. So it depends on who's sending the message, I think, more than anything else.
I think the other thing, and we've talked about this in other groups before, but the one challenge with using how the spring worked and trying to project that onto the fall, that those students already had that community built when they lost it in March, and so they had the incentive of wanting to be together in some way or another. So they already had that group me set up, right? So I'm thinking about the students who are going to be starting at fully online in the fall. How do they establish that community first that incentivizes them to check the group me or to join the group me even, right? Or whatever platform it is that they're using. So we may find an additional challenge with that. So that I think will be, it'll be really important for both faculty and student affairs practitioners to give them, Karen, as you're suggesting, a few different ways to communicate and a few different messengers.
Looks like Tommy Newsome has an idea about an app. Tommy, do you want to expand on your chat?
Sure. So it's something that I think is similar to a lot of institutions right now. There's many departments that are all trying to roll out their own way of having different social media or different platforms to be able to outreach to students. And so I will say as a caveat, I guess, is that there's a couple of different apps depending on what it's like. Many of our campuses have one designed specifically for safety and just being able to access emergency resources and things. But at NAU, we've really talked about how to still create a virtual platform where perhaps you're working with Campus Rec, but you can also utilize our health promotion, which is kind of our version of wellness and well-being initiatives that take place, and consolidate that all into one place. So that way the student can basically select which is the most applicable resource for them to utilize at that time. I will say specifically in our program, so I work with the residential colleges program here at NAU, and we have talked about implementing a website for our students that would be outward facing, that students and faculty can really utilize as different resources. And similarly, we have some social media things that we do. We've also been looking at creating a different type of tutorials through YouTube and things like that, but all of those could then be located in one spot on our residential college's website. And so in some ways it's still taking all of those platforms but centralizing it to one location, where for a student who's experiencing this, they just need to click the link and it'll take them to wherever they need to go, rather than having to figure out where do they need to go to access what type of resource. And so it kind of flips it on its head a little bit to have it be more of a funnel going outwards rather than reversed in that way. So hopefully that gives more context too.
Thanks.
And as we look towards closing up our time today, I'd like to ask the panel if they have any closing insights that they'd like to share with the group, and then we can wrap up our session today.
I don't have any words of wisdom, but I would request that, however there's a way, let's all keep sharing the ideas, because certainly these kinds of opportunities, I think, are the things that provide us with the ideas that we can pursue in ways that are fitting with our own campuses. And so I appreciate and thank everybody for all the ideas that they provided and questions that were posed.
I would say on the topic of bridging the gap and building student affairs and academic affairs partnerships, I think it's really important right now to give each other grace and to continue to trust each other, that we all have the best interests of students in mind.
And I would just say be patient through this whole process, as there's no playbook. There's no playbook that's preceded this situation that is necessarily guiding us to make the right decisions. Some of us, all of us really, are making decisions with sometimes limited information. And so we have to really be patient through the process and be okay making mistakes along the way. and know that, as in community, we'll work together to make, to get through it.
So along that line, also show compassion to the students. They don't know what their college experience is going to be like either. And I have a feeling a lot of them, when they finally get here, are going to be sorely disappointed that it's not what they expected. So there's going to be a lot of disappointment that we're going to have to broker in those first few weeks as they go through the process. And that might be something we need to warn our faculty colleagues about as well, that, they may not be thinking about that, but this is the students' one and only college experience, and they might be mourning the loss of what they didn't get.
I think my only words of inspiration, I suppose, would be that with these kinds of crises that we find ourselves in right now, which is this moment of really needing to work toward both public health education as well as anti-racist education, and in these new formats and these new ways where our communities are radically reconfigured, that innovation and resilience seem to be the two things that keep us going. So welcoming new ideas, being open to new ideas, new partnerships, new ways of doing things is, I think, going to help us get through this.
And like folks shared, I'd love any way that we can continue this conversation. We have a platform to do that. For those of you as ACUI members can access the online community, again, that Spencer shared in the beginning. And we can take this on as a thread for folks to continue sharing best practices that they've used and plan to continue and increasing these partnerships across our institutions.
And with that, I just certainly want to hop on and thank our panelists for presenting today. Those of you who are in attendance, if you could just send them a nice chat message of thanking them for their time. I hope you were able to get a lot out of today's session. Certainly great topics that we dove into today. Let's keep the conversation going on our online community. Certainly if there are topics that are of interest to you for our ACUI virtual roundtable series, always send those my way. I'm happy to continue to develop those and help give back to the profession. So to all of our panelists, thank you so much for your time and your talent that you shared with us today. To our attendees, thank you for your time and your energy in connecting with us. And we hope to see you online again soon. Have a great day, everyone.